and welcome back to 27Crows Radio. Today I have an interesting guest who actually contacted me wanting to be on my podcast. His name is Bradley, and he's the West Australian chairman of the Australian Protectionist Party. Given that I know so little about how Australian nationalists are fighting the culture war down under, I thought it would be a wonderful time to have him on and have a discussion. Thanks for taking the time to join me, Bradley, especially given that it's quite early in your lands.
Thank you so much, really.
No problem. Now, can you give me a little bit of background? How did you become a nationalist or a member of the Australian Protectionist Party?
I've actually been involved in nationalism for a very long time, really, since probably the early 90s. It was just probably a natural thing for me, I guess. There was certainly no gotcha moment or anything like that. It was,
You didn't gradually get red-pilled?
No, nothing like that. I guess, even as a kid, I was always, very sort of interested in worldly events, and I've always been very interested in history and geography and what sort of goes on in the world, and so it's sort of like a natural gravitation to politics, I suppose. But also, I guess that I was, really inclined toward, I guess, being a sort of person who likes things to stay the same rather than change too much. I was probably more inclined to conservative politics. It was just an easy thing from there.
Well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right?
Exactly. Yes, very well said. It's just very much a case of, I think, the gravitation to nationalism was very much that I got interested in the sort of like some monetary reform ideas. And that was something that I was, just sort of naturally, I think, goes hand in hand with nationalism. The idea that the current monetary system that's in use in the world is highly flawed, and that it can be and should be reformed. And so instead of having like a type of private central banking type system, we can have sovereign nations issue their own money supply and basically take back control of their nations in that way, and that's something that just appealed very much to me. Also, just this is going back to the days like before the internet. Back in those days, it was always it wasn't, if you wanted alternative information, it wasn't quite as readily available, so you had to dig a bit more for it. And but there was plenty of it around if you wanted it. And I guess I always kind of have been one of those people that's just inclined to be a truth seeker. I've always wanted to know, what the truth is, and so I think that, the more that you look for the truth, the more you discover it. And so I guess that, just took me more and more to nationalism, and then I became, more and more educated about race, learning about, the science of race, and learning how, race is a significant factor in the human drama, and also, just noticing the general changes in Australia, where I grew up myself in a small country town in Western Australia where the population was about like 99.9% white.
Lucky you.
It was a really good environment to live in, and I guess to grow up in, and I guess I kind of learned from a young age the value of living in an all-white community sort of thing. But it was just reading about other things that were happening in the country with the increased importation of Asians in particular into Australia, and how that was just really increasingly changing Australia, and I think changing us in a way that was not
Australian, right?
Exactly. Increasingly it becomes, more Asian and less Australian. And, I use the term Auschindiastan, which is sort of like my take on Australia, China, India, sort of Central Asia, Middle East. I mean, that's increasingly, what we're becoming. And I guess I don't really agree with that.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things. I mean, I'm not saying we can't coexist with non-whites. Of course we can coexist with non-whites. We've always had, non-whites in Australia, besides the Aborigines, of course, there's always been non-whites in Australia ever since we first became a nation, but it was only since we sort of abolished the white Australia policy and then started to be, bring in large numbers of non-whites and this, sort of go full on with this multiculturalism and this, where diversity then increasingly becomes like hyper diversity. And
Right.
yeah, that's the part that I didn't agree with it. Of course, that trend, of course, is happening in so many other Western European-based countries, and increasingly I'm concerned about that.
Well, I can definitely see that you would find it more valuable given that you were raised in a 99.9, as you said, percent white neighborhood growing up and then gradually seeing the change. That's kind of how it happened for me as well, where the neighborhoods were pretty much white when I was little. Then I noticed wherever I moved in the U.S., there was already a presence of a lot of minority groups. But like you said, you guys are experiencing it more from the Asian side. So how did this party come about? How was it born?
Australian Protectionist Party was formed in 2007. It's basically an attempt to revamp the original Australian Protectionist Party, which was around in the very early days of Australia. I think it began in like 1892 or something. Australia's first founding fathers were men like Sir Edmund Barton, Alfred Deakin, Sir William Lyne, Sir Charles Kingsford. These men were sort of like the early protectionists. Australia first became a nation in 1901. That's when we first became a federation, and the Australian Protectionist Party was in an alliance then with the Labor Party, and they sort of formed the government. And I guess the values that they had back then, I guess we sort of relate to them now because, I mean, they introduced at the time the White Australia policy, also trade protectionism, the idea of paying a decent wage to Australian workers and protecting their, workers' rights and protecting their interests, and not, because they were always concerned about cheap foreign labour coming in, cheap Asian labour. And so, in the very early days, I mean, the Labor Party now, by stark contrast, is nothing like the Labor Party than it once was, unfortunately.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly. But, I guess Australian Protectionist Party, but the old Protectionist Party, I can't remember exactly what happened to them. I think they merged with another party. That was a long time ago. So 2007 was the beginning of the new version of the Australian Protectionist Party. And I had a friend who was very involved in that. He was the original West Australian chairman before I was. And it was just obvious to me that this was, I think, the right political party in Australia from a philosophical, ideological point of view. And I wanted to get involved in that because I think it's so important that, when you have nationalism, when you have nationalist political parties, you've got to sort of like get the ideology right, philosophy right, and I think have good, reliable people involved in the movement as well. Good people who, don't have excess baggage, don't have criminal records, just good, ordinary Australians who are reliable people. That are the leadership group of my party has all been. All of us have been involved in nationalism for a very long time. Long before the Protectionist Party, we've been involved in other organisations. So it's sort of like, I think it's sort of important to have done the hard yards, if you like, paid your dues, so to speak, because a lot of the time in nationalism, it's not an easy road, nationalism. A lot of the time we're shining torches through long, dark, lonely tunnels. But, that's what we do in nationalism. That's what we do,
Right.
because somebody has to shine those torches. Somebody has to light the way. Somebody has to lead the path for others to follow. We don't take this road because it's the easy road. We take this road because it's the right road. And somebody has to do it. It's very much like, if there was ever an invading force that came into your nation, you'd get people who would volunteer to sign up and join the fight against the enemy sort of thing. Again, not because you like doing it, but because somebody has to do it. It's the right thing to do.
Exactly, exactly. You're so lucky that you have a lot of good people, because here we have great people, to be sure, but
Yep.
I have experienced that we need to vet once in a while for certain things, because you do get the occasional spurg and the occasional moron who wants to do something that just won't look good optics wise. So you're very lucky that you have a good foundation to start with.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we think so too.
So you mentioned the monetary system. Are you involved in crypto at all? You want to get into that to get away from the monetary system at all?
No, it's more about it's more about advocating a type of. You're probably, having been involved in nationalism, you're probably aware of how we kind of have the whole world has a type of system of private central banking,
Right.
and which basically creates a system of, I call it orthodox debt finance, which absolutely guarantees that you've got high levels of debt, high levels inevitably of taxation, high levels of high cost here, there, and everywhere. I guess I'm one of those people who, I did a lot of reading many years ago about alternative ways of doing things, because it was kind of obvious to me that we sort of lived in an age of financial poverty amidst physical plenty. It's sort of like, if you look around, it's not like we kind of have a shortage of goods or services like a shortage of goods on shelves. It's not like we don't have enough washing machines, or we don't have enough, there's not enough food on the supermarket, or, we actually have plenty of products and services.
Right?
Exactly. I mean, you could indeed use the argument that we waste a lot of stuff, and that we, in many ways overproduce, and we produce things that are not built to last. Instead, they're built to wear out quickly, so that the corporates can then go and sell more products to you, sort of thing. So, I was very interested in monetary reform systems that would, hopefully, that would not have a system whereby it's basically billions for the bankers and debts for the people, sort of thing. And so I was, very interested in alternatives to that. To me, that sort of like goes hand in hand with nationalism. I think it's monetary reform is very important.
I completely agree. So what are some of the core issues that the Australian Protectionist Party really wants to raise awareness to?
Obviously, I think the changing demographic situation in Australia, I think it's very important. We've got a situation in Australia now where the Asian population of Australia has been more than doubling every decade.
Goodness.
In 2001, the Asian population, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, was 5.5% of our population. By 2011, it's like 12% of our population, and right now I don't know the exact figure, but it must be at least 15% of the population, and rising rapidly, sort of thing. We've got a situation now whereby Australia is still, one of the very few countries in the world that still has a mass immigration policy. And I'm not sure of the exact statistic, but I'm certain that more than 50% of our immigrants are coming from Asia. I've heard that the figure is perhaps more like 70%. We've got 30,000 Indians coming into Australia as new immigrants every year, about 25,000 Chinese. And also considerable numbers of people like Vietnamese and Filipinos, and it's just sort of like been radically changing the racial makeup of Australia, and it's sort of a case of if we keep going in this direction, whites are going to be a minority really in just a few short decades' time, and I guess I don't agree with that. I think that's not a good idea at all. I'm just certain that it would, not only massively compromise the interests of white Australians, but I don't think it would be good at all for Australia as a whole, because I think it would just lead to our inevitable fragmentation and decline, and increasingly destroy our culture, destroy what's unique and valuable about Australia. And I absolutely don't agree with that. But besides that, it's also the economic direction that Australia's been going in as well. I mean, Australia is one country that's sort of like totally engulfed in this kind of liberal, global, internationalist order sort of thing. Our politicians, perhaps more than, just about any other politicians in the world, have embraced this sort of economic rationalism, free trade, open borders, selling off, vital public assets, allowing increased numbers of, foreign ownership of Australia. It's like we're just becoming increasingly reliant on the rest of the world for trade instead of producing things ourselves. And we produce oil here in Australia. I mean, we got plenty of oil, but it's like, increasingly the refineries have been closed down and it's being imported from overseas. And, we used to have this manufacturing industry in Australia that we used to have a really strong car manufacturing industry in Australia about, by the mid-1980s, I believe, about well over 80% of cars were manufactured in Australia, but it's now like, it's gone now, the manufacturing's gone. And or the car manufacturing's gone, but I'm just somebody who doesn't agree with it. It probably sounds a bit familiar to you because I know it's sort of been a similar trend in the USA, and so I guess our political leaders and the sort of like elite class in Australia, the big business communities, the think tanks, these groups have all been sort of pushing for free trade and open borders, and inevitably, I mean, we're signing all these free trade agreements with countries like China, and I don't agree with it at all because we're actually reliant on China now. I believe that 35% of our foreign trade is now with China, which is huge. It's a huge figure. We all know that China's a booming, growing marketplace and all that, but at the same time, it's a really silly idea for a nation to put all of its eggs in the one basket when it comes to trade. And especially as, look at China. It's a communist country. It's had an authoritarian form of government in one way or another for about 2,500 years, I believe. And there's very different values in China. It's not a democracy. There's no free speech. There's all kinds of problems with human rights abuses and animal rights abuses. And, China doesn't, China puts the interests of China first. It doesn't put
as they should, and you guys should put the interest of Australians first, right?
Exactly. And, that's what the Protectionist Party, really effectively wants to do. We sort of want to put Australia first and
make Australia great again.
Exactly.
I had no idea that Australia had such a great independent infrastructure to the point where you guys had a lot of oil refineries and such in your own car industry. I guess my own naivety, I didn't know a lot about Australia, but it's sad to hear that so many of your resources that could help you to be independent are being taken away because they give you no choice but to be dependent on these foreign nations that aren't going to put Australia first, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Bree. Australia actually has 98% of the world's mineral types. We also have abundant oil resources, enormous natural gas resources. We have, very great sort of arable land. I mean, okay, most of Australia is desert, but we still have plenty of good arable land that's, been well looked after, and it's considered, fairly clean and green, and we've got good agricultural land. We've got a good timber industry that's well managed, and there's so much natural resources here in Australia. We're a major producer of wheat, major producer of beef, major producer of wool, It's sort of like the primary industry in Australia has, always been strong, but increasingly we're sort of relying on primary industry, on sort of like, exporting our primary industry and then importing back, the finished product, the secondary industry sort of thing. And I guess, I think, for various socio-economic and security reasons, I'm very much of the view that it's better if we kind of try and manufacture more things ourselves and not just, sort of like become this, what's known as a banana republic, where you just sort of export everything and then import back the secondary industry, or import back the, the manufactured products. So Australian Protectionist Party is more about, wanting to put up some sensible, moderate tariffs to, try and protect Australian industry, protect Australian workers, and offer what we think is something much better than the liberal, global, internationalist order.
Now, when the Asians come down there, I know the Indians do this, but when the more Asian population comes down there, do they also take those jobs for much cheaper labor?
Yes, that is absolutely going on. I mean, you hear it sometimes in the media about, you'll hear the propaganda about, how, we can't find enough people to pick fruit, or we can't
They
find
take the
enough
jobs we don't want. Yeah.
That's right. We can't find enough taxi drivers, and any time now you want a taxi, you're almost certain to get an Indian just about.
Oh, goodness.
I mean, it's interesting because the Indians have sort of like become like the servant class in Australia. They're the sort of people who will do a lot of those sort of jobs. They don't tend to do a lot of like hard manual labour jobs, but they will do a lot of like service industry jobs, like working in call centres and driving taxis and these sorts of things. But also, it's also Australia's education system, Bree. Our education system is increasingly being used to make money for the universities. It's not so much about training Australians now. It's more about bringing in foreign students, high fee paying foreign students, often, the elites from China, the elites from India, and also like, the brain drain from the third world sort of thing. We try and bring the brightest and best from the third world into Australia, and then a lot of them, end up staying here in Australia. And it's not a good thing.
And ultimately, they end up taking your jobs that citizens of Australia should be getting, and I bet that riles up some resentment, does it?
Yeah, I think so. Although, I mean, to be honest, a lot of Australians, ordinary Australians, there's that significant number that's been, I think, brainwashed by the notion that, economic rationalism is either good for us or it's the only way of doing things, sort of thing. And that's one thing I don't like about Australia. Australia's almost like, when it comes to our economic policy, we're almost like the economic whore. We're almost like an economic prostitute. It's like we'll sort of like sell off anything to anyone. I mean, we're even selling uranium to like countries like India, China.
Weird.
The United Arab Emirates, which is like a country in the Middle East that has a nuclear industry now.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of more of the view that you sort of like try and keep, nuclear material out of the hands of those types of people.
Meanwhile, they're trying to disarm our own countries, right? Whilst giving uranium to our enemies.
Yeah, so it's sort of like, I just think we need to be a little bit more choosy and a little bit more ethical as about, who we sell produce to. I mean, the Chinese, for example, are apparently given us a guarantee that they won't use our uranium in their nuclear bombs.
Yeah, I believe you.
Now, even if that was true, it simply means that they could divert other uranium for nuclear bombs. But
just goes to show they're not just buying it from you, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, that's
man.
how it is. So, It's like, our politicians have just embraced this mindset of sort of, economic growth above all other considerations. And I don't agree with that. It's not just Australia. I mean, that's a common theme in other Western countries now as well. And I don't agree with that. I think I think that if you look around the world and you look historically, it's sort of like, every society or every empire or every nation sort of like has something that it values as its most valuable thing. Like, for example, in the Muslim world, it's Islam. They put Islam above all other considerations. In the Roman Empire, it was like, the military and the empire was sort of like put above all other considerations. That's probably true with a military state like North Korea today. I think that in a lot of traditionalist type societies, a lot of tribal societies, they put their traditions above all other considerations. In Nazi Germany, it was sort of like racial purity was above all other considerations. In even modern day Japan, they want to protect their culture and they want to protect their gene pool even, as it's sort of really important to them. But with Australia and our leadership, our elites, it's sort of like, economic growth comes above all other considerations. It's more important than preserving the national culture. It's more about preserving things like traditional gender roles or traditional ways of doing things. And I just don't agree with that. I think that's sort of like the worship of mammon. It's sort of like taking us not in the right direction. I think that we should have better priorities and standards than that.
Well, I think a lot of my listeners will absolutely agree with you. Can you give me some examples of the cultural Marxism you've seen in Australia, and maybe is there a lot of anti-white type of things going on?
Yes, absolutely. It's like the UK and probably your own country and a lot of other Western countries. I don't think we're quite as bad as the UK in terms of government tyranny there, where somebody writes something on Twitter and they're hauled before the courts for it or something.
Right.
I mean, we do have racial vilification laws in Australia. Unfortunately, we don't have free speech enshrined in the Australian Constitution. I think we should. I think that's something that you Americans got right with your First Amendment. I wish we kind of had something like that in Australia. But we do have things like racial vilification laws and anti-discrimination laws, which, can potentially be used to silence debate on various sensitive subjects. The whole cultural Marxism thing is very strong in Australia. Political correctness is, as with so many other Western countries, it's somehow managed to sort of like worm its way into the heart of our society. It's there in the, it dominates in the media. It dominates the parliament. It dominates areas like book publishing, the think tanks, the entertainment industry. It's sort of everywhere, and it's setting a lot of the moral agenda. My view is that political correctness has, I think, it's like effectively replaced Christianity as the dominant new dogmatism in the West. Particularly since the 1960s counterculture revolution, that affected the UK, it affected the USA, it affected Australia in a very big way. Our media is sort of very prog-left dominant. There's sort of like, the Murdoch press, which is probably a bit more sort of right-leaning. But we have like the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is the taxpayer-funded, basically far prog-left broadcasting Goliath. And then we have SBS, which is the national multicultural broadcaster, which is also...
they have their own broadcaster, wow.
Yeah. taxpayer funded as well, although they do have some corporate, there is some corporate funding there as well. But yeah, there's a lot of influence with political correctness, no doubt. Yeah, I guess that's one of those things that we have to combat.
So is there a sense of white guilt among the white Australians like we tend to see in Europe and the US?
Yeah, look, I think it's one of those things. If you look at what's the situation with the Aborigines, when Australia was, when the British first came here in 1788, inevitably they encountered the Aborigines. And, the obvious clash of civilisations. The Australian Aborigines are, basically isolated on the Australian continent for thousands of years. I don't know exactly how long. There's all sorts of different hypotheses with regard to that, but we do know that it was a very, very long time. And the thing with the Aborigines is that they never had cereal crops, nor did they have beasts of burden, which basically meant that they couldn't create civilization here. They largely remained a very nomadic and primitive and tribal sort of people. And
kind of like Africans, where they never invented the wheel, sort of thing.
Yeah, they did not have the wheel. They did not have a written language. They were very clever in some ways in terms of things like surviving in the desert or being able to track. If something went missing in the desert, they were very good at, finding it. But there's no doubt. When the British came to Australia, it was undoubtedly a huge culture clash for them because, inevitably you've sort of got Europe progressing, you've got the white European world just sort of like coming into like industrial civilization, when industrial civilization itself was sort of like moving ahead in leaps and bounds. And so, it was a big culture clash for the Aborigines. And I think if you sort of look around the world, I think it's a similar thing in North America and probably South and Central America with the Aboriginals and with other, shall I say, less progressive people around the world. It's sort of like, when they do become conquered peoples, there's inevitably a kind of psychologically demoralising effect on them. I think, we do have to be aware of that. But like anything else, it's like, colonisation was undoubtedly a huge double-edged sword. On the one hand, you did get things like the diseases, like smallpox and that, which, killed huge numbers of Amerindians and also, killed a lot of Australians. But at the same time, we brought civilization. We brought a written language. We brought air travel. We brought
infrastructure,
cleansing technology. We brought,
highways,
nice, soft, comfortable beds. We brought, there's so many things so many wonderful things that we brought as well, which, the Aborigines are also inevitably the beneficiaries of.
You gave more than you took. That's what Mark Collett always says, is we gave more than we took.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's very true.
But they try to use that against you think?
Exactly. Absolutely. It's certainly with the progressive left in Australia, the amount of virtue signalling which they do with Aborigines, it's like, this is one thing I've noticed about the prog left in Australia. It's I think there's like three groups in particular that they've come to virtually deify, and that's Aborigines, homosexuals, and refugees. It's like,
why does that sound familiar?
It's almost like you can't have a rational conversation with the prog left about Aborigines, homosexuals, or refugees, because, and I think that's one of the things about political correctness, because political correctness is a mindset that it's kind of very dogmatic and religious-like in the sense that it sets up its own idols. It has its own idols, and it also has its concepts of sin and heresy, sort of thing, like the sort of Abrahamic religions do. And there's sort of like chosen, favoured, preferred victim groups like Aborigines, homosexuals, refugees, women in the gender wars as well, that are, rated very highly and effectively like put at the top of the social hierarchy, sort of thing. And if you're sort of like a straight, white, heterosexual, maybe Christian male who's maybe quite successful and doing well for himself, sort of thing, then you're not valued quite as highly because you're not one of those chosen, favoured, preferred victim groups. So, that's how political correctness sort of sets things up. And then, it says that, everything that's doesn't fit in line with their value system is either racist or sexist or homophobic, or which to the prog left is like the modern equivalent of sin. It's like the modern equivalent of heresy. And, when you're sort of brainwashed by that dogmatism, I think a lot of our society, it has been, to whatever extent, hoodwinked by that dogmatism. But I honestly think that the good news is that increasingly people are challenging that. That's something that, I think you probably noticed in your own country. I mean, like most nationalists, I was absolutely thrilled with the election of Donald Trump. I thought, this is like a game changer for the world. I mean, especially...
Even the tables, didn't it?
Yeah, because it's like, Trump won the US election basically by giving his middle finger to political correctness.
It was beautiful.
Yeah, and it was like, every other US presidential candidate had sort of like had to play by the PC rules, but Trump didn't play by the PC rules. And he said not only was he not going to play by the PC rules, but he was almost deliberately not PC. And Americans, seemed to really like that. They were in tune with that. And not just white Americans, obviously large numbers of white Americans, but even, obviously many non-whites as well were obviously, sick of political correctness. It was like, you were absolutely done with it. You were finished with it. And, I think that raising resistance to it. I call it the social pendulum break. I think that undoubtedly with the dominance of political correctness and cultural Marxism in the West, it's sort of like for a long time the pendulum is sort of like the political pendulum that's been sort of like swinging increasingly left. And political correctness is not static. It's fluid, It's continually trying to move things in an increasingly progressive left direction. And it's like when the PC crowd get one, make one gain, they inevitably just try to push harder for the next game and the next game and the next game.
And then they take it too far and then people go, whoa, 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 was this always your agenda?
Yes, that's right. They are taking it increasingly too far. Political correctness is being taken to ridiculous, over-the-top extremes, and also, I think, increasingly authoritarian extremes. And, you might have noticed that the prog-left crowd are becoming increasingly, I think, arrogant, dictatorial, increasingly, they've got this mentality of our way or the highway sort of thing.
We're all for free speech until we're not, right?
Yeah. But inevitably, I think that mindset, produces what I call a snapback effect. Inevitably, what happens if you keep stretching a rubber band too far? I mean, if it goes further than what the broader community is comfortable with, then inevitably, at some point, it's going to reach like a tipping point. It's going to be like that, like a snapback effect. And I think, we're in the start of that snapback effect now. I think opposition to political correctness is stronger now than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I think it's growing all the time. I think that, the traditionalist type movement, conservative politics, the rise of nationalism in your country, the rise of the alt-right, it's gaining a lot of momentum, and I believe it will continue to gain more and more momentum.
Here's hoping.
Yeah, well, absolutely, I think it will. Um, because I think that if you sort of like try and understand, one of the reasons why we embrace political correctness is because of what's sort of like known as the universalist type ethic. I think that white European people generally, and it occurred probably like after World War II or sort of like that, what they're known as the postmodern era. And I think that as technology developed, and we sort of had like that post-colonial period, also like we had greater access to what was happening in the non-white world. We had air travel, we had the tourism industry. I think that the other key point is that white European people were in positions of, or felt that we were in positions of luxury, comfort and strength. And I think because we were in positions of luxury, comfort and strength, increasingly we felt that we could afford to give consideration to non-white people. And then, political correctness, I think, increasingly is adopted a kind of mindset whereby we not just give equal consideration to the non-white people, but we give greater than equal consideration to non-white people. And in many situations and circumstances, that's kind of like how it's applied. And the PC crowd have kind of like adopted a morality that has them believing that they are vastly morally superior, yes, because they give preference and favour to non-whites over and above white people. And, that's a bit of a problem. Because, yeah, as you would know, white people are increasingly being replaced in our countries. Our group interest as a people is being increasingly compromised. If we keep going in the current direction, we are going to drive off the edge of the cliff.
Yes.
And we need to not drive off the edge of the cliff. We need to turn that vehicle around and go back the other way, because I think that if you look at the non-Western world, the dominant ideology or the dominant value system there is still based on what's known as tribalism. It's the West that's sort of embraced universalism, but throughout the non-Western world, they are very sort of like tribal and traditional. And I think, what the Western world, I think, is doing and has to do is increasingly go back to tribalism ourselves. And I think we will, because increasingly we are not in those positions of luxury, comfort and strength. We are feeling inevitably increasingly threatened by the changing demographic situation in the West. Also, I think the Islamic terrorism threat, I think that's a big thing. I think that's a real game changer in the West. It's sort of like, it's just sort of like a ringing of the bell in our ears. It's like sort of telling us, hey, wake up, you're heading towards the edge of the cliff. You can't go that way anymore,
It is kind of the big wake-up call, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is what happens.
Yeah, it is. So, but political correctness is still very strong. I mean, because of the brainwashing, anti-racism has become almost like a modern-day hysteria. But certainly, increasingly, that mindset is being challenged, and I think it will be increasingly challenged. And, bring that on.
Absolutely, bring that on. Well, I think you've done a wonderful job with the Australian Protectionist Party. I can't wait to learn more and maybe read more of your tweets. I do follow your Twitter. Let my viewers and listeners know where they can find your work and learn more about the Australian Protectionist Party.
Yeah, Australian Protectionist Party, we're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, we're on Twitter. Our website is www.protectionist.net. If you're an Australian, please get involved with us. We're good people. We have, I think, the right ideology, the right policies, the right agenda for Australia. And I think the tenacity to keep fighting for what we believe in.
Excellent. Well, everyone from Australia listening to this, please go check that out. Send some support Bradley's way if you can. There's a video version of this podcast up at 27crowsradio.com and briefochet.com. Until next time, everyone, take care. Bye.